Buonasera, torniamo in questa nostra rubrica un po' irregolare, Liberi Oltre Confine, per discutere di un caso politico, che è un caso politico ricorrente, diciamo così, nel dibattito anche italiano, ma che è stato sotto i riflettori di recente per le elezioni presidenziali, il Cile. Il Cile molto spesso viene indicato, diciamo così, dai nemici di una prospettiva liberal-liberista, quasi come la dimostrazione che tale orientamento di politica economica possa trovare realizzazione solo ed esclusivamente in un sistema dittatoriale. Perché? Perché questo neoliberismo di cui tanto spesso si parla, molto spesso a sproposito, viene indicato un po' come la politica economica ufficiale del regime di Pinochet. Per parlare del Cile, di che cosa è successo in Cile, di qual è il modello economico cileno e di come è stato influenzato dall'andamento dei fatti politici negli ultimi 40 anni, abbiamo il piacere di discutere con un amico, con un bravissimo storico del pensiero economico, Leonidas Montes, che oggi è direttore del Centro de Estudios Públicos in Cile, ha studiato a Cambridge, è stato professore all'università, ha scritto un bellissimo libro su Adam Smith, disponibile in spagnolo e in inglese, che vi esorto a leggere e recuperare. Leonidas, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Alberto, for the invitation to have what I hope will be an interesting conversation about Chile. It's really a pleasure to see you again and to talk to you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to see you. It's a pity we are at a distance, so to say. I hope we'll see each other in the real world sometime soon. Now, the new Chilean president, El Señor Boric, claimed that if Chile was the cradle of neoliberalism, it would also be its grave. It's quite a strong statement. Now, I wonder if you can help us to understand in what sense Chile was the cradle of neoliberalism. People tend to assume this is related with the dictatorship of Pinochet. But I think it's very important to understand what happened before, and particularly what was the role of the economist in the Chilean debate, and particularly the role of the economist associated with the Catholic University of Santiago, who had some exchanges over time with the University of Chicago, hence the name Chicago Boys, which it's even the name of a piece of theater, of course, critical of neoliberalism, that was on stage a few years ago. So can you help us in making sense of what was the situation of the economic science, so to say, historically in Chile, and how people's opinions were aligned, at the time of the presidency of Salvador Allende?
Well, it's, as it happens with all history of economic thought, it's a very complex history and it has a lot of nuances, one could say. And it's not, when we talk about neoliberalism, we have to be careful about what we mean by it. What does it really mean, neoliberalism?
And does anybody know, really, what neoliberalism means?
Yeah, whatever that means, okay? The story behind what happened with the Chicago Boys is not monolithic at all. It's full of coincidences and different protagonists, one could say. But it all began, I would say, in the 50s. And before that, Chile, from an economic perspective, in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, it was a country with a moderate, I would say, GDP growth and inflation. On average, inflation would be 40% during that period in the 50s and 60s. And how the Chicago Boys emerged is a sort of I mean, it's very easy. In the 50s, I would say 1953, there was a guy here working for the 4 points for the USA, the foundation in sort of agricultural improvements in the south of Chile. And I mean, it was, I don't know, Theodore Schultz, who was the chairman of the economics department at Chicago, was in Chile. They met, they tried to make a link with Universidad de Chile at that time to create a program of exchange between Chilean students that would go to study economics at Chicago. Universidad de Chile, which was at that time a state university, didn't like the idea of having a program with the University of Chicago. At that time, Universidad Católica had a small faculty of economics, business and economics, I would say, and Católica signed that agreement in 1956, if I don't remember, I think in that period. And that exchange, they began to send 2 students per year, the best students at economics at Universidad Católica, not only from Universidad Católica, that's very interesting, because they also sent students from Universidad de Chile, which are the 2 main universities in Chile. And that program began to work, I mean, with very small number of students that would go from Chile to study economics at Chicago, on average 2 per year, I would say. But from an economics perspective, the leading intellectual influence was led by the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, what is called the ECLAC. I mean, that was, just remember that ECLAC was, the base was Santiago de Chile for all Latin America. It was very influential. We have all the, what we call the dependency theories, the import substitution theories promoted by Singer and Previch, who were the main figures at the ECLAC. They had huge funding at that time. They would give courses. I mean, the economic influence of ECLAC was with no parallel for Latin America and for Chile particularly. All the dependency theories and the import substitution programs were led by ECLAC. And on the other side, you have this small program between Universidad Católica and Chicago. So in the 60s, I mean, the overwhelming influence was from these protectionist theories that were implemented, of course, by the idea that you would need more central planning in the economy. I mean, that's from the economics perspective. In the 60s, the Chicago boys were those who would go, Alberto, to study to Chicago. They would come back to learn, or to not to learn, to teach at Universidad Católica. So the economics department at Universidad Católica, there was a small number of those who studied at Chicago that would come back to teach what was called at that time price theory or microeconomics. And they were, I mean, Chilean society at that time, they would consider them a bunch of crazy guys. I mean, they began to promote the ideas of market freedom and opening up of the economy for the campaign for Jorge Alessandri in the early 60s, okay? And there is a testimony that they had a meeting.
Who was Alessandri? What was his party?
Alessandri, let me tell you that. Before Allende arrived to power, we had 2 governments. Jorge Alessandri, who was a center-right, I would say even businessman, okay, who was in power between 58 and 64. And then we elected the Christian Democrat Eduardo Frei between 64 and 70 before Allende. I mean, to put it simply, Alessandri was more on the right and Frei was more on the center left. And at that time, Frey received a huge amount of financing from the United States, okay? A huge amount, and they promoted what was called at that time the revolution with liberty, okay? Liberty revolution. That was because, I mean, just remember that we were in the middle of the Cold War, and the United States were very concerned about what was happening in Latin America, particularly in Chile. So Frey received a lot of support from the US, but coming back to the Chicago Boys were, I mean, were very unknown and considered some crazy guys, a bunch of crazy guys who wanted to open up the economy to promote market policies. And I mean, this is interesting because when they were working at the campaign of Alessandri, he invited some of the Chicago boys and he said, well, these are crazy guys. I mean, they couldn't be here. And this bunch of people, only five of them did a PhD in economics, okay? But they were very, very active teaching, writing papers about the price system. I mean, and remember that the economy in Chile at that time was very controlled, one would say. I mean, the denationalization of copper had already begun with Frey. The agrarian reform had already begun with Alessandri, and it was pushed forward by Frey. And in 1970, we elected Salvador Allende as the first Marxist president elected in a democracy in the world. I mean, he got 36% of the votes, and he became the president of Chile with the motto, I would say, of the Chilean road to socialism. That was the main motto of his campaign. We are in the middle of the Cold War. We have the West and the East. We have the Russians and the Americans. And then we have this first Marxist president elected democratically in 1970. And he pushed, following a socialist agenda, a much oriented central planning economy. Just to give you an idea, the first 2 years or the first year and a half were a success in economic terms because they issued money, okay? But what happened at the end of the day, the state began to control all the companies. Copper was completely nationalized. All the Chilean copper, all the investments from other countries were nationalized by Congress with the support and the idea of Allende, of course, with no compensation at all. Because at the time of Frey, they bought shares from mining companies and they tried to nationalize copper, but paying back. But with Allende, they simply nationalized the copper. The links, I would say the relations with Russia, Cuba, and China at that time were strengthened. And Allende began this so-called road to socialism, nationalizing copper, nationalizing the financing, the banking system. I would say 85% of the banking system was owned by the state, fixing prices all along Chile. Okay, prices were fixed. I think that over 3,000 products were, the prices were fixed, and you had different prices, whether you were in the south of Chile or in the north or in the central regions. The prices were different because they had many economists and engineers working out and trying to figure out what would be the price, considering big, huge programs that would include transport, the price of grapes in the south and all that. And it was a really incredible economic experiment that happened during Allende. As I told you in the beginning, it was a success because, I mean, they issued a lot of money, unemployment went down, economic growth went up. But what happened in the late, after 2 years, inflation went up very high. There were shortages, and in 1972, I think that the inflation rate was over 200%. In 1973, inflation was 606%. So it was crazy. I mean, that was as all the socialists at that time recognized the failure of an economic program that was condemned or doomed to be a failure.
So these are the circumstances in which the military coup happened, basically.
Yeah.
So after, I mean, in a sense, if I understand you right, you did have some collectivization policy, even with Frey before, agrarian reform, nationalizations were quite common all over the world in those years. I mean, clearly in Latin America, but also in Italy, as a matter of fact. With Allende, you got basically this trend speeding up, reaching the financial sector. So you got, in fact, collectivization of investment and nationalization without compensation, and inflation skyrocketing to 700%, which is mind-boggling. Then, of course, you got this tragedy of the military coup. But my question is, I mean, when the military is entering into the picture, did they have any economic ideas of their own? Were they entering the picture because the opposition was powerless in parliament? Did they have any clue of what was going on themselves? Why did they end up looking at the Chicago Boys? Because other economists, the ideas of the other economists were tried before, perhaps, and so that was the only new game in town.
Well, that's another adding more complexity to this already complex history, Alberto. When after the coup, I mean, we know what happened with human rights during the coup, and it was brutal.
Absolutely.
The first 2 years were absolutely brutal. But just remember that the first thing that the militaries did was to close Congress. So there was no opposition at all in political terms. And in the beginning, these 4 guys, which was called the junta, they didn't have a clue about what was going on. I mean, one has to be fair that they had in the beginning, commissariats in the different departments and in the different ministries. They were, I would say, almost putting people from the army, from the policemen forces, from the Navy in different positions. But nobody has a clue what was going on. And the militaries, they didn't, I mean, remember that Pinochet took over gradually also, because the junta were 4 guys from the different armed force. And Pinochet didn't have a clue about the market or anything like that. So in the beginning, it was a real mess, I would say, in economic terms. Nobody knew what was going on, but everybody knew what inflation was and how inflation was affecting the majority of the Chileans at that time, because I mean, is the toughest tax on the poor people. And the main aim was trying to bring down inflation. Chile at that time had a huge debt. Right after the coup, the price of copper was very low, historically low, I would say. We had huge debt. If Frei Montalva had left some reserves for Allende, they were completely consumed, I mean, in 2 years. So Chile was indebted. Creditors all over the world were very worried about Chile. They didn't want to lend money to Chile, not even even less to a dictator. So the economic situation was very, very complicated. Oil prices were booming also. And if you remember, still not today, but at that time, the Chileans would talk about copper as the bread of the Chileans. I mean, copper was the most important product for surviving, I would say. So the economic situation was a complete disaster, not only a disaster, I would say a tragedy. And it was a gradual thing in the sense that there is a myth that these Chicago boys wrote what we call the brick, okay? Traditionally it's called the brick, okay? El ladrillo. And it's true, they had written a small manifesto, I would say, on the economics reforms that the country needed. And there is a myth that this brick was in the desk of all the important guys from the military government and all that. And I don't think, I mean, it's difficult to say, but in 73, they still were considered, these Chicago boys, a bunch of radicals, okay? They didn't even have the support of the elite. I mean, the big entrepreneurs at that time, who were still rich, of course, not rich in global terms, but rich in Chile, they were used to negotiate the prices of their products and all that. And there are many anecdotes and testimonies of people, entrepreneurs, who would go to this the RINCO department at the Ministry of Economics to negotiate, for example, the price of their tea bags, okay? And it was a very complex negotiation, as you can imagine, or the price of wine. So not even the private sector were very keen on what these Chicago boys were saying, because they were used to work with inflation, they were used to work with negotiating the prices of their products. So they were still considered, I would say, in 73 and 74, a bunch of weird guys, okay? And what happened? At one stage, the junta appointed Mr. Jorge Caguas as super finance minister, okay? And Jorge Caguas was a very relevant figure at that time, because Jorge Caguas was not a Chicago boy. He had studied at Columbia economics. He was a member of the Christian Democrats Party. He was a very well-respected person and a very well-respected economist in Chile. He had been vice chairman of the central bank with President Frey. And Jorge Caguas appointed some of the Chicago boys to help him out with what was called at that time the National Recovery Plan. And in Chile, it was called the National Recovery Plan. But of course, the press called it, and today we will talk about the shock treatment, okay? It wasn't a shock treatment in the sense that one would think. It was a sort of a fight, I would say, against inflation and a way to try to recover what the agrarian reform and the estatization of so many companies that were in the hands of the government, of the state, and the state could not support those companies because there were losses all around these state-owned companies. So it was a process that it was a shock indeed, but it was the first attempt to open up the economy. And after Jorge Caguas, who was a Christian Democrat, I mean, it was a political complex situation in that sense, because he had belonged to the government of Frei Montalva, and many Christian Democrats at that time, including President Frei Montalva, had criticized fiercely the plans of Allende. Okay, they thought that what was going on with this so-called Chilean road to socialism was leading towards Cuba. And there is I would say that there is a very famous visit, which is a very tasty detail, that Fidel Castro was invited by President Allende to visit Chile in, I think it was in 1972, when the economy was booming and when everybody thought that the Chilean experiment in this road to Marxism had worked out, because I mean, there was low unemployment, GDP was growing, but all this was done issuing money from the central bank. I mean, we were heating up the economy, and the consequences, we lived them at the end of 1972, and of course during 1973. And this visit was very, very funny, I would say, because Fidel Castro was supposed to come for a few days, invited by Allende, and the visit actually was in November 72, but Fidel Castro stayed for almost a month in Chile, giving long speeches all along the country. He would visit the north, the south, and at one stage, I mean, what one would see through the press and all that is that Allende was a little bit uncomfortable with the protagonism of Fidel Castro, who was promoting more radical policies at the end of the day, because what Fidel Castro really wanted was a proper Marxist revolution. And at the end of the day, I would say that Allende, and this is true, was a true Democrat. I mean, he wanted to stick to Congress, he wanted to stick to elections, and he had Fidel Castro at that time stirring up the pot in a way. Yeah. Lionizing the basis of the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. And on the other hand, Allende was losing the protagonism of the president in Chile, who is a strong figure. But at the end of the day, what happened in political terms, because we already talked about what happened in economic terms with inflation and unemployment and all that in 73, the thing that really happened with Allende is that he lost the political control of the situation. I mean, I think that even the Socialist Party, that was his own party, gave the back to Allende. And the Communist Party, of course, at that time was controlled, or not controlled, but led during the Cold War by Russia. So Allende was in a very dramatic and tragic situation. And that's the reason why at the end, in September 73, we all know that he committed suicide, okay? And the theory, I mean, at that time, the theory was that, or the news was that Allende had been killed during the coup, but we know for certain that he committed suicide. So it's a very sad story, but the truth, to be fair, is that Allende lost control of his political parties, and at the end of the day, even the Christian Democrats were supporting what was called at that time the white coup that became a black coup at the end of the day. So that's basically what was happening.
You said before, I mean, when the junta is taking power, they have no clue about the economy, and in a sense, from military people, you would expect an appreciation of top-down decision making, not anything like market liberalization. How come that at a certain point some Chicago boys enter into the government or influence it, and how smooth was the relationship between the military people and these Chicago boys?
There is a key figure here, Alberto, who is Sergio de Castro. And after Jorge Caguas finished his National Recovery Plan, Sergio de Castro was appointed in 1977 Minister of Finance after Jorge Caguas. And Sergio de Castro was one, I would say, the leading figure of the Chicago Boys. He had done his PhD at Chicago. He was from Católica University. And as you say, one of the difficult issues to understand is how a vertical mindset of the militaries would go to these market-oriented policies, which are more horizontal in a way. And that's, it reminds me of a famous article that Milton Friedman wrote on Newsweek, for Newsweek, after his second visit in 1981. We can talk about that. That's also a fascinating issue. And one of the questions that Milton Friedman had was why these military, who are vertical in terms of orders, are trying to promote a market-oriented policies and even to give up power, because at that time during Milton Friedman's visit, the second one in 1981, there was already a road towards the transition to democracy. We knew through this, I mean, it was not a certain road, because I mean, no dictator would like to give up power, but at this stage, after the new constitution that was enacted in 1980, we knew for sure that we would have elections in 1988, okay? And that's the famous time when the Chileans said no to Pinochet with 55% of the votes, and the yes lost with 45%, and the yes would have meant that Pinochet would have stayed 8 more years in power with a new Congress, of course, at that time. But Sergio de Castro was the main figure, I would say. And in the beginning, in 74, 75, there were some Chicago boys in some state departments, some ministries and all that, but they were scattered all around. But when Sergio de Castro arrived as the finance minister with the trust of Pinochet, okay, who trusted these crazy guys with the idea that the economy has to be opened up and we had to fight against inflation. Well, I would say that Sergio de Castro was the one who led this group of people and who appointed others, Chicago in the central bank, in other ministries and all that. And I would say that this is very interesting, but at that time, there was an agreement between Latin American countries in what was called the Andean Pact. And all the countries will meet up, I mean, the Argentinians, the Brazilians, the Colombians, the Peruvians, to negotiate import tariffs, okay? And it was crazy because at that time, all the importation tariffs were differentiated. You had luxury goods, you had to pay for machinery, and it was all a mess. I mean, it was like a price control, but you would control what came into the country. And they would negotiate the price of copper, the price of grapes. So all countries would meet up at the annual meeting to negotiate the import tariffs. And this anecdote is very funny because Sergio de Castro, as new minister, arrived to this meeting with all the other finance ministers from all the other countries, of course, in the context of the Cold War, in the context of dictatorships, because Latin America had dictatorships all over almost all the countries. And Sergio de Castro said, well, we are resigning from the Andean Pact. We will open up our economy. And all the other ministers, they thought that he was joking. They thought that he was trying to negotiate more advantageous conditions for the Chilean products. And he was not joking. I mean, he declared at that time through a decree signed by Pinochet, of course, and the junta, that all import tariffs were fixed at 10%. Okay, so it was all unified at once, and it was, I mean, it was the beginning, I would say, at that time of the opening up of the market economy, which was very convenient for Chile because Chile is a very small country, and we depend at the end of the day on commerce with other countries. So that measure was the beginning, I would say, of the opening up of the economy for a market-oriented policy. And with Sergio de Castro, all the privatizations and the, I would say, the return of land from the agrarian reform were deepened with a very speedy hand at the end of the day. So that was the period of what one would call the market-oriented policies of the Chicago boys.
It was a bumpy road, though, right? In the early 80s, instead, the military government somehow cooled down, I mean, when it comes to free market policies, isn't it?
very, very bumpy road, Alberto, you're absolutely right, because the success, history repeats in a way, because the success of the second half of the 70s, opening up the economy, promoting imports and exports, privatizing companies or different state-owned companies, coming back to a private banking system, leaving one state-owned bank as it was, with better prices of copper. It was a success, I would say, at the late 70s. But remember that in 1982, there was a huge recession with oil prices booming, going up again, skyrocketing, with copper again at a low price. And in Chile, we had, and this is a conundrum, one would say, we had a fixed rate of exchange, okay? And this is interesting because when Hayek came to Chile, he wondered why in Chile, I mean, they're so market oriented, but you have fixed exchange rate. And it was a very complicated story because, I mean, even Milton Friedman was promoting free exchange rates. But in Chile, we have the price of the dollar fixed to the peso, to our peso. So you would pay 39 pesos for $1. And with the 82 crisis, that was a huge recession for Chile, mainly because we had huge debts. I mean, the private sector had huge debts in dollars, okay? And that was, I mean, just to give you an idea, in 82, unemployment reached 25%, okay? GDP decreased in 82, 14%. So it was a huge economic crisis. And at that time in 82, who were going to be blamed? The Chicago boys, of course. I mean, they were promoting all these policies. And this is, I mean, as you say, it was another bumpy road because, I mean, what would you expect from a dictator to blame the Chicago boys? But, I mean, we don't know why, but Pinochet and the junta persisted with a sort of market-oriented policies. There were, at that time, during that crisis, 5 finance ministers in a period of 2 years, which is very unusual for Chile because traditionally in Chile, since the 19th century, we have 1 or 2 finance ministers. Chile has been always very responsible, except Allende, because during the Allende government, they were swapping ministries from the different parties in the Unidad Popular coalition. But this was another interesting story because at the end they appointed Hernán Vigi as finance minister in 1985, and the advantage politically and the dictatorship of Vigi is that he was not from Chicago. He has studied at Columbia. He was not an economist. He had studied engineering. So when they appointed Hernán Vigi, he brought another new plan to promote exports, to open up the economy again, okay? And it was a huge success. What Hernán Vigi did in 85, 86, 88 was incredible in terms of that there was a new recovery through market-oriented policy. And to make a long story short, we had the famous plebiscite in 1988, where the so-called the no won with 55%. In many ways, what happened after was exemplary because we had elections. President Elwin won as a Christian Democrat. We came from a very strong dictatorship where Pinochet would say there was not a leaf on the floor that would move without him knowing what was happening. And there was this exemplary, I would say, transition to the Elwin government in 1990, and all the market-oriented policies were sustained, I would say, but with a social focus. I mean, what they wanted, what they promoted was economic growth with more equality. And in that sense, all that period, which is called the Concertación, that were governing for a long period of time, was the most successful economic history in all our Republican history. I mean, the economic growth, the GDP, unemployment low, inflation was controlled. So Chile became an example in the 90s of economic and political stability.
Absolutely. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but what basically happened is that after the referendum, after the fall of the dictatorship, you had center-left governments up to the election of Sebastián Piñera, in some sense. And if I understand it correctly, you certainly got, some elements of more welfare-oriented public policies, but at the very same time, the basic of the Chilean economic model, which is monetarism, if you wish, I mean, strong emphasis on controlling inflation on the one hand, and on the other hand, an open economy, fully integrated internationally, stayed there. So I suppose, I mean, my sense was that you got sort of a widespread bipartisan support for economic freedom in Chile. Now, how come that in recent years, this widespread bipartisan support for economic freedom basically collapsed? Because as you said before, actually, as you wrote in your beautiful paper on Friedman's 2 visit to Chile, people in the Concertación governments were people who had been jailed by Pinochet or whose relatives had been jailed by Pinochet. So they certainly had, very strong personal reasons to reject whatever was bequeathed to them by the dictatorship. But instead, Chile went on for 30 years, basically, staying on the same track. But then something happened. You got students revolts, you got younger left of center politicians like the new president, Mr. Boric, like Camila Vallejo before him. They got center stage. We are now in the process of drafting a new constitution that would be certainly different than the one you had, and that was good enough to manage this democratic transition. So what happened? Why did this bipartisan support for economic freedom collapse?
Well, that's also very complicated, Alberto, to give an answer to what has been happening in Chile lately. And there are many different explanations and many variables, I would say, and many theses about what has happened and why we have recently elected President Boric for president. And I mean, there was a discourse against inequality, of course, that was politically productive in many ways. I mean, at one could argue that those grandfathers and grandmothers of the Concertación who led this very successful transition with economic growth, with the control of inflation, and with political stability, in a way, they were blaming themselves after the university and students' movements of the from 11 years ago or 10 years ago, when all these figures that you mentioned came up to be political leaders in our Congress. I mean, Boric was a congressman, our new president. Giorgio Jackson, another leader of the students' revolts, is also a member of the Congress. Camila Vallejo of the Communist Party, who was a leader of the students' movement, was also in Congress. So one could see that the so-called Frente Amplio, which joins all these movements and the different political parties in Congress, at the end of the day defeated what we call the Concertación, and even defeated the political movement that Bachelet in her first government called the Nueva Mayoría, okay? So in political terms, this was the success of a group of young, new political leaders that defeated Concertación and defeated Nueva Mayoría and convinced many of their grandparents that Chile needed a new revolution, okay? So what we are living today has a sort of parallel with what we live in the early 70s. They never, these young politicians who are becoming government in March, they never assumed that there had been a transition in the Concertación. They want, and this is sort of psychological in a way, they want to have their own transition, okay? What I'm trying to say is that there is also a generational issue here, okay? Because this new generation of politicians have been criticizing not only neoliberalism, with the beautiful remark you made in the beginning, that now Chile would be the grave of neoliberalism if it had been a cradle, but they want to have their own transition because they believe that their predecessors, who are Concertación and Nueva Mayoría, were not sufficiently strong to promote real socialism in a way. Now, this is very complicated because this is also emulating in a way what we live in the yes and no referendum. I mean, just remember that it was 55 and 45%. So 45% at the time of the Chileans at the time in 1988, they wanted by fear, whatever, I mean, we can talk about that, but they wanted to have Pinochet 8 more years. It's difficult to imagine that from the perspective of today, but 45% wanted Pinochet to carry on. And today, in the last elections where we confronted a left, and I would say almost a radical left candidate as Boric, who is still today joined with the Communist Party after he defeated the communist candidate who was Jadwe and gave a big surprise because this young guy defeated the communist Daniel Jadwe, and the Communist Party in Chile is a very traditional communist party from emulating what would happen in the early 60s. I mean, they are very doctrinaire, they are very obedient to the central direction of the party. And on the other hand, this time we had I would say, a right-wing and even extreme right-wing candidate who was Jose Antonio Cast, okay? Who is an ultra-conservative guy from the right who obtained again 45% of the votes, okay? So in a way, Chile politically went to the extremes, okay? We had a candidate Boric and candidate Cast who were, to put it simply, from the far right and from the far left. And now where you are living today, politically, because the Congress is divided in half. I mean, the control, 50% of the Senate is in the hands of the right. So Boric has a huge political challenge and also a huge economic challenge because the market signaling of the last year has been disastrous for the Chilean economy. The dollar has skyrocketed. Investment is low, and there has been a huge amount of capital outflows that are mainly due to the uncertainties that you mentioned. I mean, we have a new government that in a way is trying to moderate, to go back to the center left. We have an assembly, a constitutional assembly that is writing a new constitution, and there is a lot of uncertainty because by the end of July, we the Constitutional Assembly has to have a new constitution, okay? Parallel, we have a left government that has to deal with not only with polarization, which is what we have been living lately, but also with the fragmentation of different political parties in Congress. Today, we have in Congress 21 political parties. And I would say that one of the recipes for the political stabilities that we lived in the 90s and early 2000th century, was the aware that we would have two big blocks and they would tend to the center. So it's a very complicated panorama, as you say.
It is, but in many ways, I think, Leonidas, you're giving us a panoramic view of politics by which we can say that after 30 years of relative stability and strong economic growth, really, somehow the Chilean are missing the excitement of more extreme political options. Hence, polarization, the big polls being fragmented and all of that. And of course, I mean, when it comes to the left, looking back and resenting the 1990s, that's a global phenomenon. I suppose there's no person who are more hated on the left these days than Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, that, somehow are people symbolizing this sort of balance between a free market, free trade-oriented economy and some, more efficient attempts at organizing the welfare state. I know you have to go, but I cannot resist by asking you a question. So we got this picture of, the Chicago boys really being nothing like economists being parachuted from the United States and being basically a small group of university professors and teachers who got their price theory from Chicago and, basically by chance getting into government and having a go at the Chilean economy in a very difficult situation. But of course, if there is somebody who paid a personal price for Chile, was Milton Friedman. When Friedman received his Nobel Prize, he was usually criticized because of his leaning towards the Chilean regime. And he paid actually only 2 visits to Chile. And you wrote a beautiful paper with Sebastian Edwards about exactly this, these 2 visits. So how can you tell us, what was the extent of Friedman's personal involvement with the Chilean situation, and how did he deal, if he did at all, with the Chilean government of that time?
Well, you're absolutely right. Let me add before to your previous question, Alberto, that many people, many intellectuals here in Chile, they claim that there was from a social perspective, there were high expectations about the future. I mean, there is a very strong, what we call a very strong middle class in Chile, with younger generations attending universities and all that. So in that sense, we have to be also aware that if Chile was an economic success during the 90s and early 2000s, the last 2 governments from Bachelet and Piñera have experienced a very moderate economic growth. And some people claim that that has been one of the reasons why people feel at the end of the day with the joke of debts and many things, and with not having economic growth as we were used to have when we were growing 7% per year.
For how many years did Chile grow around 7%?
Yeah, that was in the early 90s. I mean, we would go 7% per year as China did for a long time. So that's another issue. Now, coming back to the very fascinating Milton Friedman issue, if there was one would say a victim of visiting Chile, that was Milton Friedman, of course. I mean, remember what happened when they gave him the Nobel Prize. At that time, the remember that Chile exiled many communists, members of the Communist Party and many members of the socialist parties, and they were organized in different countries, especially in Sweden. Sweden received a huge amount of exiled Chileans. It's a fascinating history, and I tend to agree when Milton Friedman wrote in his autobiography with Rose that because he dedicated a complete chapter with an appendix to what happened in Chile, because this was a shadow that accompanied him for, I mean, until he passed away. I mean, and he said, I mean, there was a sentence here very much in a Friedman way. I don't know whether to be more amused or annoyed when people say that I was controlling the Chilean economy from my desk at the Chicago department, okay? And the truth, I mean, to be fair, what actually happened is that Friedman came to Chile in March 75, when the Chicago boys were not powerful still. I mean, when Chile was trying to, I mean, he came to Chile, why? He came to Chile invited by Rolf Luders, another Chicago boy, very prominent in Chile, who studied with him. He's the only Chicago boy who did his PhD with Friedman. He came to Chile because he wanted to, I mean, he was like a medical doctor, Friedman, and they would say, even Harvard would say that there were like medical doctors who would like to see what was happening with inflation. His main concern for Friedman was inflation. And here he had a country which had 600% inflation after promoting central planning and protectionism and all that. And he, I think he genuinely wanted to see what was going on. And he would visit not only Chile, but he went to Yugoslavia, went out to China. He met with Pinochet, okay? And it's very interesting because what we know from that meeting with Pinochet is that, remember that at that time in Capitalism and Freedom, already Milton Friedman had written in the 60s, 62, if I don't remember, yeah, 62 was Capitalism and Freedom. And he had this idea at that time, remember that we are in the Cold War and that Milton Friedman is he would call himself a Republican with capital R, and he was a strong libertarian, a public figure. And he would say, I mean, the idea went off my mind, but Milton Friedman would say that that economic freedom would necessarily lead to political freedom. I mean, that was his statement. He saw a necessary condition between economic freedom and political freedom. And a testimony from Rolf Luders, who was at that meeting between Pinochet and Milton Friedman, the translator, is that Milton Friedman told Pinochet, listen, if you're going to promote market-oriented policies, if you're going to open up the country, you have to know that, I mean, and you know that Milton Friedman would say this to a president, a taxi driver, or whatever. I mean, he had that sort of character. And he would say to Pinochet, listen, if you carry on with economic freedom, that would necessarily lead to political freedom. And in that sense, it's interesting because he came in 75 before Sergio de Castro assumed as finance minister, because the Chicago boys had any major influence. And let me tell you this, I mean, in a way, he was instrumental towards the so-called National Recovery Plan. I mean, all the major newspapers who were supporting the dictatorship at that time, the major newspapers in Chile, they put in the front page that Milton Friedman was promoting the National Recovery Plan. So in that sense, I would dare to say that he was instrumental to what came later, which was the National Recovery Plan. But the real influence was from the Chicago boys in Chile, not from Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was a prominent international figure that visited Chile, okay, that gave speeches, all the questions and answers are published. So he was very open. I mean, just to give you an example, he didn't visit any private university. He gave 2 speeches, okay, at Universidad Católica and Universidad de Chile.
Visit, right?
Yeah, in the first visit in 75. And the title of that speech, of that lecture, was The Fragility of Freedom. Okay, newspapers, of course, didn't cover that at that time. And that speech he gave at Universidad de Chile in Santiago, Universidad Católica, The Fragility of Freedom, he already sustained this idea that economic freedom promoting economic freedom. And he recorded his memories from his visit to Chile, and he reminded Milton Friedman himself in his recording. They would use tapes at that time, that he felt when he was talking about the fragility of freedom, that the public, the students, were shocked. Well, of course they were shocked because we were under a dictatorship. So it was very interesting. But he didn't have any major influence. I would say that the leaders of the reforms were actually the Chicago boys. I mean, he visited Chile once in March 75. He came back in November 81 for attending the Mont Pelerin Society meeting, the regional society meeting of the Mont Pelerin. And at that time in 81, one could see that he was a different Milton Friedman from the Milton Friedman who visited in 75. I mean, you know, as I know, that what happened to him with his visit to Chile, that they would think that he was the promoter of the economic policies. I don't give him that much influence or much importance of what the Chileans live in the opening up of the economy. I think that the real the promoters of that were the Chileans, not Milton Friedman. But the interesting addition we made with Sebastian Edwards on that paper that you kindly mentioned is about the 81 visit, which is very interesting because that's rightly previous to the 1982 crisis. And we tried to find out what happened with the exchange rate. What was his opinion about what was going on in Chile, not politically only, but also in economic terms, because at that time, it was really difficult to understand that Chile had a pegged rate. And if Milton Friedman had been the real influence, we wouldn't have had a pegged rate and we would have a free exchange rate. So basically, I think that's a very interesting chapter of our economic history. But to answer bluntly to your question, I don't think that Milton Friedman had the influence that people assume on Chile. It was another change of different events that were gathering to make him the leading figure, but neither him nor Hayek were very influential. The ones who promoted, as Milton Friedman would say, this was made in Chile. I think that resumes the issue.
Leonidas, thank you very much. As a very last question, do you think the legacy of those reforms now is going to be swiped away by the new president? You described this parliamentary situation as very difficult, so Mr. Boric won't be able to do whatever he cares. But still, you know, his election clearly signals a different consensus in the country. So do you think what will be left out of those reforms in 5 years from now?
Well, that's a very controversial question. Not even the economists, we don't like to predict. I mean, unless we follow the positive economics of Milton Friedman. But I mean, I think that the Chileans in general, they like to have free commerce. They like to consume Chinese products. Okay, so I see very difficult that a small economy like Chile will come back to the protectionist policies of the 60s or the early 70s. I think in a way that Chileans in general are much more liberals in the European sense of valuing their own merit, their own effort to attain what they have to achieve. So in that sense, I see very difficult that the elected, once we have Boric as president, that he will promote a wipe out of the so-called economic Chilean model. Okay, I don't like to talk about a model because it's a very complex word, and we actually, it's like talking about neoliberalism. What do we mean by the Chilean model? But I think it will be very difficult politically and socially for Boric to wipe out everything that the Concertación did in terms of economic progress in the broad sense, not only in terms of GDP per capita, but in terms of exchange, in terms of opening up the economy. Many people from the Communist Party and from the so-called Frente Amplio that support Gabriel Boric, they wouldn't like to have a free trade agreement, okay? And they oppose the free trade agreement. But I think it will be very difficult and politically unfeasible to wipe out all that. I think that the Chileans are used to have commerce, to have exchange. I think it'll be difficult with the confirmation of the new Congress that a sort of nationalization of copper will happen. I don't think that will happen. We have to keep, of course, seeing how it all evolves. But I think that the real challenge that Chile is facing is basically with the new constitution. That will be crucial because that will define the next 30 or 40 years of our institutional framework. But I don't know, I might be naive, Alberto, but I think that Boric needs to have the support of the center left parties that were those that he vociferously criticized from the Concertación and the Nueva Mayoría. But I think that once he becomes president, he will need to recover what they did in terms of economic terms. I mean, it's not inimical that President Lagos, who had been fiercely criticized by Boric, gave his support to Boric. Okay, he's a social democrat in the broad sense. He's a sort of Chilean Tony Blair, if you want to put it in that way. And it's not a coincidence that even Michelle Bachelet supported Boric on her last visit to Chile. So the crucial issue is whether he or how he maintains his relationship with the Communist Party that today has a strong representation in, not a strong, but a stronger representation in Congress. But I think the crucial issue today, the real challenge, it is what will come out with the new constitution. And I keep the hope that the Chileans are still reasonable in that sense, and sensible.
Well, Leonidas, thank you so much. I think it's been a very fascinating conversation for me, and I've learned a lot, and I hope that people that will listen to it will learn a lot likewise. I hope we'll see each other soon in the real world, and thank you so much again.
No, thank you to you. It's a fascinating story. I hope I'm glad that you have enjoyed. I also enjoyed remembering back previous research. So it's always fascinating to remember what we can learn from history of economic thought in general. So thank you very much, Alberto, and I really look forward to see you in the near future.
Grazie mille.
Grazie mille a te. Ciao.